Food is more than just what's on our plate. It's the places where it's grown, it's the people who grow it, and so much more. Join me, Janice Person, your host, on Grounded by the Farm every other week as we talk about the foods we love. For this episode, we are going to be taking a little different step in time. We are going to be talking to Kyle Woodson and Wesley Miles, who are both archaeologists and work with the Gila River Indian Community. And they walk us through some of the things that we can now tell about prehistoric use of irrigation in that area, as well as sort of historic, the kind of things we think of in the U.S. timeline. But going back to thousands of years ago, they can tell us a lot about the Pima and the Maricopa people that were in that area and bring us up to date on some of the things that are happening there now with those communities. So I think it's an incredibly rich opportunity to learn some things that may not have been in our history books, and it's brought to life by people who are really experiencing it and looking into it with deep science as well as with culture. Our next episode will follow up on this and be an interview with a farmer in that area, and he grows some of the traditional crops. The video will be up on our YouTube and groundedbythefarm.com. You're going to want to see it. And let's go ahead and get started with Kyle Woodson. And I asked Kyle to help me understand sort of his fit with the community out there.
Yes, thank you. So again, my name's Kyle Woodson, and I am a professional archaeologist. I am the director for the Gila River Indian Community's Cultural Resource Management Program. So I'm kind of a director level, departmental kind of level. In some ways, I'm a leadership of departments, but I'm not technically tribal leadership, which would be the governor, lieutenant governor, and the tribal community council. But I do work very closely with the council, the executive office, a lot of other folks in leadership positions to help make sure that we're doing everything we can to do right by tribal members here in the community, and to, in particular, with our job, is to help to manage the cultural resources of the community, which of course includes archaeological sites, as well as other important traditional sites that might include sacred sites and shrines, traditional cultural properties, and other such resources.
It's amazing the different things that you guys know about the land because you're able to study it at some depth. And you told me at a certain point there was a time where we started investing in archaeology. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So I'll do the real super crash course. So
Okay.
The Gila River Indian Reservation was actually the first or one of the first Indian reservations created in the United States. And at the time, this wasn't even part of the U.S. yet in terms of a state. Arizona had not been formed. So 1859 was when this reservation was actually originally formed in its original shape, but it's grown actually significantly to that, to almost 580 square miles in area currently. Okay. And there is roughly 22,000 enrolled tribal members. Correct. About. Okay. That's kind of, snapshot of the reservation. But yeah, archaeology within the United States really didn't become kind of formalized until kind of later in the 1800s as a discipline, and almost exclusively in an academic setting, or in the case of the Smithsonian, they were actually some of the earliest to send out ethnographers as well as archaeologists to kind of really create a documentation of what kind of cultural resources and the tribes who were still residing within the United States. So the Smithsonian was actually one of the very early ones to do that. But yes, you're correct. What we do today as cultural resource managers really didn't become a discipline until 1966 with the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act and then the National Environmental Policy Act shortly after that, which all requires, as part of federally sponsored or funded projects, that impacts to cultural resources and other environmental resources be considered. So that's kind of where our job came from.
Fantastic. I know that was a long introduction, but I appreciate your doing it. Now, Wes, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do? And are you also part of the community officially? Are you an employee of the Gila River Indian Community?
Wesley Miles again. It's my name. I'm also, in addition to being Pima or O'otham, I'm also of Navajo and Apache descent, Western Apache. And I identify as an O'otham person because I grew up here on the reservation, and the lay of the land and everything just kind of, it's just where I'm from and what I'm about.
I think all of us feel that in some way, but your place is definitely different than the city of Memphis where I grew up.
Right. It's very different out here. But I started when I was young, and I've been working here at Gila River for 21 years. Basically just kind of entry-level position. Didn't know I wanted to do this until I did it.
Yeah.
And then once I was in the field, basically I decided, okay, I want to do this, as a career. And so I set out to do school like maybe 10 years after the fact.
That sounds awesome. Would you mind telling me the mixture of tribes? Because you certainly told me that your family's history has several. In this area, I talk about it as the Pima kind of people. But is there other tribes that are also on this reservation, or just other reservations in the state? Because I know Arizona has a lot of Native peoples.
So it's the Gila River Indian Community, and the reason why we use the word community is because it's actually different tribes that live here together, kind of like peacefully and kind of a similar lifestyle. We have Pee Posh or Maricopa in addition, and they habitate like the west end of the reservation. So there are other tribes here, and there's also Salt River, which split off from us sometime in the past, the recent past.
Yeah.
And Akimel community. And then we're also related or like cousins with the Woodson and Wesley Miles, also known as Papago.
Okay.
So we all share like a similar language, except for the Pee Posh, but kind of similar lifestyles in the past. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense then that
So it's a community of people together. It's not just Pima.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my mind, I always think of Pima because, as I told you, I had a friend I grew up with who was Pima, and the Pima Expressway and Pima Cotton, and so that's
right.
But I want to make sure I acknowledge the others.
I guess when you say Pima, you're probably referring to Akimel O'otham, which are river people.
Yeah.
And then there's the desert people, Woodson and Wesley.
Okay.
So those are people from like Sells and Tucson.
Yeah.
To the south of us that don't really live near like river areas.
So help me understand the Gila River, and I don't know which is best for, it starts in is it New Mexico? I've been to the cliff dwellings over there. So the river really feeds part of this community?
Oh, yeah. The river is like, it's our bloodline. It provides everything to us. It's our substance, subsistence. We grow our crops with it. Obviously, it's our water. Like our whole history has been based around the river. So, yeah, it's extremely important.
It certainly is critical for producing food and everything. You're in the middle of the desert.
Yeah, it's extremely critical.
Kyle's going to show me a map, which I'm going to take a photo of so we can put it on the...
We will definitely provide digital copies of these. So, just to kind of tag off what Wes started. So, yeah, you're right. The Gila Cliff Dwellings is actually roughly where the Gila River actually begins. It in those mountains right there around Gila Cliff Dwellings.
Okay.
And several of those branches come together in western New Mexico. They flow obviously into Arizona, very far eastern side, and it flows directly through the middle of the Gila River Indian Community as shown on this map. So that gray line is the sort of stream bed of the Gila River as it is today. Where it exits the reservation at the very far northwestern edge is also where it joins with the Salt River, which is the main river coming through Phoenix.
Okay.
So the Salt joins the Gila River, and the Gila River flows down further into western Arizona to Yuma and enters the Colorado River.
Okay. So it does join the Colorado River.
It does, yes, at the very southwestern sort of corner of Arizona.
Okay.
So, so that's kind of a quick snapshot of what the Gila River represents here.
Well, and people have been talking about water a lot recently because of drought issues in so many parts of the country. And knowing this feeds into the Colorado is probably the most political of the rivers and discussions. I understand the Gila people have had access to water reinstated or something. There was controversy where it was taken away and reinstated.
Right. So early European settlers basically moved upstream of this community and built canals and built dams and basically started to drain the river of its water and draining the our lifeways and our ability to grow crops. It just diminished maybe late 1800s. So that was basically illegal. We had prior rights usage to the water.
Exactly.
And it was established with our canal systems, which were documented, being as old as, early 1800s.
Yeah,
So,
the canal systems is pretty exciting.
Right.
Very.
Yeah.
But it's been reinstated, at least in part, which is allowing greater growth in this area for the community, right?
Right, and that's the topic of the Smithsonian Magazine article, which you read, and you can certainly provide a link to.
And we're absolutely going to put a link, and we don't want to copy it, but I wanted to make sure. I think that's a big piece because a lot of Americans who don't have Native connections don't necessarily think about some of the things that we did as people at different times and how it impacted folks that we had already taken a lot from. So
you could do a whole podcast on that topic, but the extremely brief version is that after more than 100 years of dialogue, argument, litigation about these matters, in 2004, the Water Settlement Act that was passed, which reallocated the Colorado River water allocations to tribes and other, users, the Gila River Indian Community became a major beneficiary of a very large proportion of the water that they have now been able to.
A lot of rights have been reinstated.
They've been reinstated, and then the other part of this article is about the construction or reconstruction of the irrigation system here to help use that water in a more efficient and, technologically modern way.
And that's why we're talking to archaeologists, because you guys have done some really interesting work in understanding what irrigation canals were with a lot of cool technology is the way I understand it. Was it satellite technology, remote sensing?
Yeah, we've used all of those to explore prehistoric canal systems in the past. A lot of boots on the ground walking, a lot of survey has been conducted to reveal this map that you see before us. So we've done all those things. I don't know if specifically if you want to go into.
No, I absolutely do. So I'm one of those people who, when I go to places like Israel, I've actually had an archaeologist show me through Jerusalem and help me understand a lot of things. And in Turkey, and I think a lot of Americans think of archaeology as something we do on vacation versus in our own lands. So understanding how this water comes from New Mexico and what people were doing here when with that water to flourish as a community, what they were growing, how they set those systems up is beyond intriguing, because I think people think of the aqueduct systems of the Romans, but isn't this very similar? It's just more U.S.
There's nothing else like this in the U.S. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, prehistoric irrigation system.
Well, it is a desert without the water.
Right.
These days. So water is absolutely critical, but then it's an amazing oasis with the water.
Right. And, that's something, I guess, because of how would you say, I guess it's just the right location to bring out canals, coming out of the mountainous area here. And then you have, flatter areas where you're able to draw canals out. And that's something that's important, and it's probably a reason why people settled here. I don't know, Kyle, if you want to continue.
Sure. He hit right on it. If you look at a map of Arizona, a lot of people don't understand that there's a lot of mountains here in Arizona.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like always ranges. There are just mountains that pop up, and they don't seem to be connected to a range. They probably are. But.
Right, and even though there are parts of northern Arizona that are pretty flat, but it's also very high elevation, and the water availability is not quite what you would need to really grow extensive farms that happen here. So Phoenix, of course, was founded for the same reason, but 1,000 years or more before Phoenix was founded, the ancestors of today's Akimel O'otham peoples, which we as archaeologists have called Hohokam, but properly should probably be called Huhugam, which is a O'otham word meaning the basically ancestors, people who have come before present-day peoples who are living. And this part of the state had vast amounts of relatively flat lands with a very long growing season and perennial rivers running right through it. Now, I want to make sure I do point out that these canals that you're seeing here on this map along the Gila River, there are also extensive canals along the Salt River, where you just came from, in Scottsdale and the Phoenix area.
Yeah.
So all of these canal systems began to be built in earnest around what we might call the beginning of the Common Era, around basically 100 AD. But
100 AD.
100
I just want to
AD.
say that one more time.
So 2,000 years ago, roughly, we think that probably there were a little bit earlier in the Salt River, but between about maybe 100 and 300 AD, these peoples were building the very first canals that would eventually become these extensive systems that you see these maps now in front of you.
It's amazing.
But I do want to point out that even before that time, as long as 3,000 years ago, there were folks that were likely ancestors as well of the people that lived here later on, that were first building irrigation canals in like the Tucson area and some of these other slightly higher desert locales along the Santa Cruz River and some other tributaries. So we know now, as a result of a lot of this kind of cultural resource management work that's been done over the last 30 years in Arizona, that irrigation farming technology began here completely independently of what happened in Mexico and ancient Peru. They basically independently invented building canals to farm fields along the riverbeds as early as 3,000 years ago. So what we think is that the people who originally started doing that type of farming in the Tucson area later moved into this part of the state in the Gila River area and began doing the same thing here, but on a larger scale.
And help me understand, if that was 3,000 years ago, we're talking like the time of like, I don't know, Machu Picchu, or like what is, because there are places that are in our minds that we know historically, and we don't know this about the
Right. So, yeah, this would be before what we would call Huhugam or Hohokam, because that entails not only just doing canal irrigation, but also a whole way of living, their lifestyle, the foods they grew and ate and gathered, as well as their crafts and the way they built their homes. All of that kind of came together a little later on, like in that time period I mentioned, like between like 100 and maybe say 400 AD. But prior to that, it was something different, but kind of similar. They were still living in kind of mud and brush huts. They were doing this irrigation, but they weren't necessarily living there all year round, which is what you were seeing here. So this was more of like a semi-sedentary style from about 1000 BC.
So maybe seasonal movements?
Yes,
or something?
More seasonal movements and kind of a slower adoption of more sedentary lifestyle in that period of time. It's kind of a big break archaeologists are really key in on, is where that sort of mobile forager, hunter-gatherer style of life moved into a more sedentary and agricultural way of life. And again, it varies across the whole country, but here that was a real key, led to a whole host of other kinds of developments. When you're living permanently in one place with a bunch of people and what became villages is very different than moving around seasonally with smaller groups of people, sometimes gathering in large groups, but basically you're living more off the land and the resources. So 1000 BC is well before Machu Picchu, well before Teotihuacan, well before the Maya.
I knew you could put it in context.
So we're talking like in the time frame of even some of like the Egyptian pyramids that were still being built at that time. Now, some of the earliest, the big Giza pyramids, I mean, those were like 3000 BC or something like that. So not quite that old, but we're talking like pre-Roman Empire, pre-height of Greek, you know, what you think of Greek society and civilization. I mean, maybe the early stages of that going on in the Mediterranean.
And part of that, I just assume, was that when the people who get to collect the history that pass it along don't appreciate. That's why people like me never learned it in school.
Right.
I mean, is that?
Yes,
okay.
absolutely.
I want to make it. I want to make sure I'm following.
That is absolutely right.
In this irrigation system, what have you been able to figure out about the canals, and how were they able to, what were they creating in terms of irrigation canals, and then what did that enable their community to grow? Or
sure.
Yeah, so they're all earthen-lined canals. They're, they all draw from the river, usually with one main branch, and then from there, when they get it up to a higher terrace, they'll split it out. And one of the reasons we think they do that is because it protects these systems from flooding. Flooding is a major issue every year, so when that happens, it's pretty destructive.
And that is because there's snow in the mountains?
Right, the snow
okay.
runoff. So, and then there's another flood season in like late summer.
Okay.
Yeah. So those kinds of things kind of lead to their design that you see here. Snaketown in particular, there's a lower terrace here that we don't think there's any kind of irrigation going on here. But of course, if there was, it was all swept away, hundreds of years ago. So you can see this system here. Once it gets to the higher terrace, it's a lot more protected from the big floods.
Okay.
And this main branch here would probably get flooded out every year. So that's something we've learned from, studying all the systems, not just this one.
So each one of these is an irrigation channel they put in?
Right. So this would be like a main branch, and then you see this dendritic pattern, like kind of spreading out.
I'm going to have to show you guys this map. It's the one that says the prehistoric canal systems. And it is amazing in that, you see the Gila River is very big and strong. And there's how many canals come off of this, or how many channels?
Remember the number?
We have
Dozens?
confirmed 13 separate systems, but there may have been as many as 15 separate or even more. But we have definite documentation on 13 separate canal systems that were built.
So many, and then each of those systems have the smaller pieces that get you more directly to exactly where you need the water in order to grow something right.
Right. And so they would serve these communities, and we have villages associated with them, and it allowed them to grow crops probably twice a year. There was probably 2 growing seasons.
Okay.
And the primary crops that we've learned from doing studies of soils, like pollen and other means, we found out it's a lot of maize, cotton.
Okay.
What else?
Beans and squash.
Squash.
The three sisters.
The 3 sisters, yeah.
Absolutely formed the core, and cotton.
Right.
And so, cotton was more of a fiber staple, but you can eat cotton seeds. So, I mean, there was some source of protein there, but the main, crops for
you can use the oil or
consumption,
whatever.
would be the maize, beans, and squash. And then there were others, and again, and we're talking about prehistoric time period, so this would have been before the introduction of European crop varieties, like wheat in particular was a major staple that later in the historical period, when O'otham farmers adopted that from the Spaniards, they grew, literally tons and tons of wheat. And I think if you have read that article, you knew that, during the 1800s, this area was known as like the bread basket of Arizona. It was a phenomenally productive area for agriculture.
It's so interesting because I think a lot of people we consider wheat came from like Persia. It came from areas, Turkey. It came from areas where it absolutely was desert-like, and we may grow it in Ohio where you have lots of water.
Right.
But there's definitely wheat that would thrive in this environment.
In fact, since you bring that up, Mesopotamia, or today's Iraq primarily, is a very good analog for the environment here and the way that irrigation was done there along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers on a far larger scale, mind you. But that kind of environment is very similar here, and the kinds of issues that farmers would have had to deal with in terms of soil drainage, salinization and waterlogging and those kinds of issues are very similar in those two environments because they're basically both deserts.
Okay. So help me understand
you have all these great towns or villages along the way, and you said people would migrate seasonally or something. Do you think the same people were living in some of these villages at different times of year? Or do you think, how was the movement actually working back then?
Well, that's a good question.
I was going to let you take that.
So as I mentioned, what we're looking at here and talking about in the Gila River primarily was built and used over about a millennium between 450 AD and 1450 AD. That's pretty much the main core of what we call the Hohokam Millennium.
Okay.
But by this point in time, we are fairly certain that they were largely basically sedentary in their own villages. Because by that time
sense.
And now keep in mind, there's other factors that go into this, because if you go to the effort of building out a farm and your fields for your family and your extended family, that basically becomes your livelihood, and it also is acknowledged historically in these types of societies, that's your property.
Yeah.
Now, the community shares the water and other parts of the landscape,
Right.
and there were other rules about that, but the one part that we do feel quite confident that was the case is that your farms were your property, so you would want to stay there and make sure you tended them and you passed them down to your kids and their so on and so forth. So we do feel like that's another real key signal of this sedentary lifestyle. As you start to live in one place, you develop these kinds of rules and sort of policies, so to speak, amongst the villagers and the settlements that,
social
this
agreements.
is yours, this is ours. We all work together to do this
We all
part.
contribute this for
Right.
these things.
Yes, and then this is my area or my family's area, and this is where we make our livelihood.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So can you help me understand the role of science and all these things we're talking about? Because I think that's, it's a social science, everything we've talked about,
Sure.
but a lot of what you know because you're using physical science, I assume.
Yes.
Also.
Wes, you want to start?
Well, in physical science, we use a lot of geology,
Okay.
geoarchaeology, and techniques like reconstructing stream flow of the river. It'd be a big science that we use to kind of get a sense of when major floods happened back in time.
Okay.
So we use, we'll basically make a trench and draw a profile. We'll look at all the strata. We'll have an expert come and analyze what that means in terms of like a flood chronology. So that's something in irrigation studies that not only extends to the river, but canals themselves. So how we analyze a canal, besides looking at the map and, overhead, we'll also draw cross sections of canal profiles, basically dig a trench, expose the canal and profile, and then describe each layer of sediment. And the characteristics of that sediment will tell us something about, the size of it tells you how much water could flow.
Yeah.
And that kind of measurement tells you how much farmland they could irrigate.
Yeah. So I think most people have seen like a profile of soil where it shows like topsoil, bedrock, all that kind of stuff, right?
Right. We do that.
But what you're saying is on top of that, you can tell how the water has impacted different zones or what may have been removed at one time and then
Right. So that
then new sediment was formed on top of it or something. You could tell how it differed from another piece right over here, like 5 foot away or something.
correct. And the core of that science is all geology based.
Yes.
Stratigraphy and all that. So that's one way that we use science to analyze these canals, and probably the primary way to directly analyze them.
Right. Yeah, and and then there's
others.
You can go into more and more detail by we actually will collect actual physical samples of these sediments out of the canals, and in the laboratory you can split these out into analyzing, what kind of pollen was left, what kinds of, botanical remains were left in there. And if you find burned material, you can actually do a radiocarbon date on that material to see how old was that sediment layer, deposit, or at least that particular piece of charcoal or a seed or what, like a burnt piece of grass or something. So, we get further and further into that. You can even date the actual sand particles themselves by a method called luminescence dating, which basically dates how long ago that grain of sand was exposed to sunlight. It's basically a radioactive decay, kind of similar to radiocarbon dating, but it's kind of a different way of looking at it. So we can get highly technical and scientific with how we approach the analysis of these things. And as you already mentioned, from a maybe more of a bird's eye view, we can use satellite imagery, drones. We do that now. There's a lot more. Wes has become quite expert with this. And then just good old-fashioned walking on the ground and looking with your eyes, and it's you can see a lot by doing all that together. Kind of contributes to how we reconstruct these canal systems.
And so all of this stuff is coming together at a time where you have more water available to the people in this community.
I mean, the basis of our whole program was built upon that water settlement. We started with PMIP. I don't know if we've talked about the Pima Maricopa irrigation project, but it is an article. Mm-hmm. And that's how our program was born, just to take care of the cultural resources that are in the project that will be impacted by this new system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so cool that it's kind of dialing it back to where, figuring out what was and what can be, and figuring out how to combine heritage and new ways at the same time, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, just introducing agriculture back to young people, and stuff, bringing the water back. So it's actually something you can pursue. I mean, I know, have you worked with Gila River Farms?
I haven't.
No. That's been a program that's been around for a while.
Okay.
I'd like to see more young people into farming.
I would
and get
too.
into it, because you see a lot of people not, I don't want to say they're all non-community members, but, I don't see enough young people wanting to do it.
Yeah.
And that's part of our tradition here is O'otham.
I think I noticed in the article they talked to some young farmers who were trying to get started, right? And I think knowing you have elders in the community that can also help would probably be a big factor for folks. And I know you guys have some great farmers in the community. I assume there's a nice way of working together.
Well, yeah, and it's, you've hit on a topic that, and Wes says too, where this goes from here has yet to be seen.
Yeah.
The water has been litigated. They have the access to it. The system is being improved. They have the capacity to expand farms back again. But the nature of farming has changed dramatically since 150 years ago, because back then it was strictly subsistence farming that
right.
families and extended families were doing their own
you
farming
needed the
on their
corn
own.
to live.
Right. But now it's far more industrialized.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, the way that the land management and ownership has changed over that time period has also dramatically affected how individuals like this family in the article can farm lands.
Yeah.
Now, there are people that have sort of allotments of lands that are like 10 acres in size, and they can do some farming, like garden level farming on those plots. But to farm at a level where you can actually make a living,
a commercial
you have to do it on a large scale, which requires leasing multiple parcels of these allotted lands. And that has really changed the game. And that takes fund, that makes money, other resources, mechanical machinery,
right.
and all kinds of, logistical kind of issues. And that I'm sure that Terry Buttons will be able to tell you all about that. So it is kind of still a big barrier now for people like Wes or others who may really want to do it. They may not be able to do it on their own, but
right.
they might be able to do it as part of one of these companies, that do this kind of agriculture.
Yeah.
So it's kind of going to be interesting to see how this goes from here, because it really has changed a lot in that amount of time.
And I know, Wes, you were talking about you were interested in some of the heritage, some of the ancestral kinds of crops.
Yeah, I part of the research side of this brought me into my own traditions and my own history,
Yeah.
And so learning about heirloom varieties was very inspiring, because corn itself, like its long history, is about people modifying a naturally occurring plant and making it more teosinte, and then coming up with maize or un, and which is the O'otham word for corn, becomes so central to our way of life, and to a lot of Native people's way of life. So that legacy is very interesting to me, and how corn's branched out into different varieties, for various reasons. So I have an interest in the corn because it's so central to a lot of people's ways.
Did I forget to ask you something? I know we've had this going on. I think we've gotten through my notes, actually, which is surprising because I was expecting me to go off into too many different areas. I feel like I learned so much more. I want to make sure everybody reads the Smithsonian piece because it's great. Are there other things that you would suggest people read to learn about the people in the Gila River communities or some things like that I ought to look up?
Well, I wish I could say that there's like a source book or something like that, and the tribes don't really have that. I mean, you can get some education by going on their website, gilariver.org, to look, and they've got some background there. There is a museum here on the community that presents their stories of the community and their peoples. It is open now. They've got some lovely exhibits, and they're developing other exhibits, and it's located up near the casinos, which are on the northern boundary of the reservation near Phoenix and Chandler. So, if people who are living in Arizona are here, I'd really encourage you to visit and go to the Huhugam Heritage Center. But otherwise, other than we can probably give you some links to some, literature.
That'd be great.
And there are some older sort of ethnographic books, like in particular one that even we still use is called The Pimas, which was written by one of these Smithsonian anthropologists named Frank Russell, which is still a very good source book for sort of that period of time around the turn of the 20th century and the late 19th century kind of ways of life and doing things. But there are others that we could, get some suggestions.
And I'm just going to assume that since Ramona is up there this week, the Smithsonian's Native American Museum has some great information if people are in the D.C. area, or don't just go to the Museum of Natural History or something like that. Branch out to some of the other properties.
Right. The National Museum of the American Indian would definitely be a good place to go, and I do believe they have some parts of those exhibits that deal with the O'otham peoples and the Arizona tribes.
Kyle, Wesley, thank you so much for doing this. It is very unique for me, and I appreciate your access because I really love learning about this and to be able to pass it on to others who may not have even known that they should be interested yet. Thank you very much. I appreciate your sharing the story of your people.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. You're welcome.
So I hope you were like me. I just had such a sense of wonder, and I wanted to dig in more. So in the show notes, the depth of version that we keep on groundedbythefarm.com, we'll have a lot of links. We'll have some of those links in the show notes and all the apps, but you can always go back to the link that it provides you back to the website for a little more depth and that video. If you're interested in hearing more stories like this, I'd love to hear from you guys. Or if you'd prefer that we do more that are specific to a type of food or something, I love to hear from you, whether it's on social media or via the website. So thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks with that farmer story.